The smoke was so thick that night in Wickenburg, Arizona, that Matthew Keller could barely see his own hands as he threw open the barn doors, the screams of trapped horses echoing through the inferno that had once been the livery stable where he worked. It was September of 1884, and the dry season had turned everything into kindling. But Matthew did not think about his own safety as he plunged into the burning building, only about the animals that depended on him. The heat seared his lungs with every breath, but he kept going, releasing horse after horse from their stalls, guiding them toward the doorway even as the roof beams groaned overhead. He had saved 7 horses when the ceiling collapsed in the back corner, sending up a plume of smoke so dense and poisonous that when he breathed it in, something fundamental changed inside his throat. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like swallowing hot coals, but he stumbled out with the last mare just as the entire structure came down behind him. Matthew woke 3 days later in the doctor's office above the general store, his throat wrapped in bandages that smelled of camphor and herbs. Doc Morrison sat beside his bed, his weathered face grave as he explained what had happened. The smoke had damaged something deep inside Matthew's throat, something the doctor could not see or fix with the limited medical knowledge of their frontier town. Matthew tried to speak, tried to ask questions, but all that emerged was a rasping whisper that faded into nothing after just 2 words. By the end of that first week, even the whisper was gone. At 24 years old, Matthew Keller had lost his voice completely, and Doc Morrison could offer no hope that it would ever return. The town of Wickenburg treated him like a hero at first, patting him on the back and buying him drinks he could barely swallow, his damaged throat making even water feel like ground glass going down for those first few weeks. But as the novelty wore off and people realized he could not speak, could not answer questions or participate in the easy banter of saloon life, they began to drift away. The livery stable owner gave him a small compensation for his bravery, but explained with genuine regret that he could not keep employing a man who could not call out to customers or communicate with the other workers. Matthew found himself adrift, his savings dwindling, taking odd jobs that did not require speech, mucking stables, hauling freight, anything that involved muscle rather than words. Jessica Norton arrived in Wickenburg on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, stepping down from the stagecoach with a worn carpet bag and a letter of employment clutched in her gloved hand. She was 22 years old, slim and determined, with dark blonde hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet and green eyes that took in everything with quick intelligence. The letter promised her a position as governess to the Hartwell family, wealthy mine owners who lived in the largest house on the edge of town. Jessica had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a bookkeeper who had died 2 years earlier, leaving her with few options but to seek work wherever it could be found. She had answered an advertisement in a Boston newspaper, corresponded with Mrs. Hartwell through carefully written letters, and now here she was, standing in the dusty street of an Arizona town that looked nothing like the civilized eastern cities she had known. The Hartwell house was indeed impressive by Wickenburg standards, a 2-story structure with real glass windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Mrs. Hartwell was a thin, nervous woman who seemed perpetually worried about the heat, the dust, and whether her 3 children were receiving an education suitable for their station. The children themselves, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, and a girl of 6, were wild as tumbleweeds, unaccustomed to discipline or structured learning. Jessica quickly realized that her job would be more challenging than any letter could have conveyed, but she was determined to succeed, to prove herself capable and earn the salary that would allow her to eventually save enough for her own future, whatever that might be. Her first encounter with Matthew Keller happened 2 weeks after her arrival, in the general store where she had gone to purchase slate and chalk for her students. She was examining the limited selection of educational supplies when she heard a commotion near the front counter. A man was trying to communicate something to the storekeeper, using his hands to gesture and point, but the storekeeper was growing impatient. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that held both frustration and resignation. He wore the simple clothing of a working man: denim pants, a worn cotton shirt, scuffed boots, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of strength barely contained. "Look, I don't have time for this guessing game," the storekeeper was saying, his voice carrying across the store. "If you cannot tell me what you want, I cannot help you." Jessica watched as the man's jaw tightened, watched him point again at something behind the counter, then mime the action of hammering. The storekeeper sighed heavily. "Nails? You want nails? What size? How many? Honestly, this would be so much easier if you would just speak up." Something in the man's eyes, a flash of pain quickly hidden, made Jessica step forward before she quite knew what she was doing. "Excuse me," she said, her clear Eastern accent drawing both men's attention. "Perhaps I can help." She turned to the silent man, really looking at him for the first time, seeing intelligence in those brown eyes, and something else, a deep weariness with being misunderstood. "You need nails for building something?" He nodded, and she saw relief flicker across his face. "Large nails for construction, or smaller ones for finish work?" He held his hands apart, indicating something of medium size. "Medium, then. A pound? 2 pounds?" He held up 2 fingers, then reached into his pocket and pulled out coins, counting them carefully before holding them out. The storekeeper took the money with a grunt and went to fill the order. The man turned to Jessica, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then he touched his hat in a gesture of thanks, and something in that simple motion conveyed more gratitude than a speech might have. She found herself smiling without quite meaning to. "You are welcome," she said, though he had not actually thanked her aloud. Somehow she had understood his meaning anyway. Over the following weeks, Jessica saw the silent man around town several times. She learned his name was Matthew Keller, and that he had lost his voice-saving horses from a burning barn. The story was told to her by Mrs. Hartwell, who shared it as an interesting piece of local gossip without much real sympathy. People felt sorry for Matthew, Mrs. Hartwell explained, but what could one do? A man who could not speak was at a severe disadvantage in any society, but particularly in a rough frontier town where communication often meant the difference between getting work and going hungry. Jessica found herself thinking about Matthew more than she probably should have. There was something compelling about him, about the way he moved through the world with quiet dignity despite the obvious challenges he faced. She noticed things others seemed to miss: the way he always held doors for women and elderly people, the way he helped load heavy packages into wagons without being asked, the way children did not seem afraid of him, even though he could not speak to them. He communicated through actions, through gestures, through the expressions that played across his face when he thought no one was watching. Their second real interaction came on a Saturday morning in early December. Jessica had taken the Hartwell children on an educational walk, pointing out different types of desert plants and discussing their adaptations to the harsh environment. Young Amelia Hartwell, the 6-year-old, had wandered too close to a prickly pear cactus and gotten several spines lodged in her hand. She was crying and her brothers were being less than helpful when Matthew appeared as if from nowhere. He must have been working nearby because he had a shovel in one hand and dirt on his clothes. He took in the situation with one quick glance, then knelt beside Amelia, his face gentle and concerned. The little girl hiccuped, tears still streaming down her face, but something in Matthew's calm presence seemed to soothe her. He held out his hand, palm up, asking without words if he could see her injury. Amelia, with the instinctive trust of children, placed her small hand in his large one. Jessica watched as Matthew examined the cactus spines, his touch careful and light. Then he looked up at Jessica, and she saw the question in his eyes. She understood immediately that he was asking if she had tweezers or any tool to remove the spines. She shook her head, and he nodded, thinking for a moment. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small folding knife, the blade worn but clean. He showed it to Amelia, then to Jessica, his eyebrows raised in a clear question. "May I?" "Yes," Jessica said softly. "Thank you." What followed was a masterclass in patience and gentleness. Matthew worked slowly, using the knife's edge to carefully lever out each spine while making exaggerated, funny faces that made Amelia giggle despite her discomfort. He never rushed, never showed frustration when a spine proved stubborn. When he finished, he pantomimed brushing off his hands in an exaggerated gesture of completion that made all three children laugh. He returned the knife to his pocket, tousled Amelia's hair gently, and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Keller," Jessica said, and this time she put real warmth into the words. "That was very kind of you." He touched his hat brim again, but this time he also smiled, a real smile that transformed his face and made Jessica's heart do an unexpected flutter in her chest. His eyes met hers, and in that moment something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or the first stirring of something that might become more than simple gratitude. After that day, Jessica began to pay closer attention to Matthew whenever their paths crossed. She started to notice patterns in how he communicated. His face was extraordinarily expressive when he allowed it to be, his eyes conveying emotions that many people hid behind words. He used his hands to sketch shapes in the air, to indicate size and direction, to mime actions. He had developed a vocabulary of gestures that anyone could understand if they simply paid attention. But most people, Jessica realized, did not want to pay attention. It was easier to dismiss him, to grow impatient with the extra moments it took to understand him, than to actually see what he was saying. She began to make a point of stopping to talk with him when she encountered him in town. At first, their exchanges were simple. She would greet him, ask a question that could be answered with a nod or shake of the head, and then continue on her way. But gradually, the conversations, if they could be called, that grew longer and more complex. She learned to watch his eyes, to read the subtle shifts in his expression. She learned that when he looked down and to the left, he was remembering something. When his eyes crinkled at the corners, he was amused even if he did not fully smile. When his jaw tightened and his gaze went distant, he was frustrated or sad. Matthew, for his part, found himself seeking out opportunities to be where Jessica might be. He took jobs that kept him in town rather than out at remote ranches or mine sites. He timed his errands to coincide with the hours when she might be walking the children to the small church that served as a school on weekdays, or shopping for supplies for the Hartwell household. He told himself he was being foolish, that a woman like her, educated, refined, from back east, would never seriously consider a man who could not even speak his own name aloud, but he could not seem to help himself. There was something about Jessica Norton that drew him like a lodestone draws iron. Winter in Wickenburg was mild compared to the eastern winters Jessica had known, but the desert nights grew cold, and the days had a crystalline quality that made everything seem sharp-edged and bright. On Christmas Eve, the town organized a small celebration at the church, with caroling and refreshments and a general air of goodwill that transcended the usual hardships of frontier life. Jessica attended with the Hartwell family, helping to manage the children, while Mrs. Hartwell fluttered about socializing with the other prominent families. Matthew came to the celebration alone, standing at the back of the church during the carol singing. Jessica spotted him there, his lips moving silently to words he could not voice, and something about the sight made her throat tighten with emotion. When the singing ended and people moved to the fellowship hall for coffee and cake, she found herself navigating through the crowd toward him. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Keller," she said when she reached him. He smiled at her, that transformative smile that made him look younger and less careworn. He mouthed the words back to her "Merry Christmas," and even though no sound emerged, she understood perfectly. "Are you enjoying the celebration?" she asked. He nodded, but his eyes flicked around the room with something that might have been loneliness. Jessica understood suddenly that he was alone here in a way that went beyond his inability to speak. Everyone else had families, friends, connections. Matthew stood apart, forever on the outside of easy companionship. "The Hartwells are leaving soon," she said, making a decision even as she spoke. "But I would like to stay longer if you would be willing to walk me home afterward. It is not far, but it would be nice to have company." The surprise in Matthew's eyes was quickly replaced by pleasure. He nodded, more emphatically this time, and she felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the hot coffee she was drinking. True to her word, Jessica made her excuses to Mrs. Hartwell an hour later, assuring her employer that she would be perfectly safe walking the short distance to the small cottage behind the main house where she had her quarters. When she emerged from the church into the cold, clear night, Matthew was waiting by the front steps. He offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him even through the layers of fabric between them. They walked slowly, neither of them in a hurry. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any city lights, and the desert air carried the scent of creosote and dust. Jessica found herself talking more than usual, telling Matthew about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her father and the bookshop where she had spent so many happy hours, about her decision to come west after his death. She was not sure why she was sharing so much with someone who could not respond in kind, but something about Matthew's attentive silence made it easy to speak. He listened in a way few people did, giving her his complete focus, and occasionally his hand would come up to touch her arm gently when she said something particularly poignant, a wordless gesture of sympathy and understanding. When they reached her cottage, Jessica was reluctant to end the evening. She turned to face Matthew, and in the moonlight his features were all planes and shadows. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "I enjoyed your company very much." He hesitated, and she could see him struggling with something. Then, slowly and deliberately, he placed his hand over his heart and then extended it toward her. The meaning was unmistakable even without words. The gesture touched her deeply. "I feel the same way," she whispered, and saw joy flash across his face before he controlled it. He touched his hat one more time, then turned and walked away into the night, leaving Jessica standing in her doorway with her heart beating faster than it should have been. After that Christmas Eve, something shifted between them. Their encounters became less accidental and more intentional. Matthew would be waiting near the general store when Jessica came to shop, ready to carry her packages. Jessica would find excuses to walk past the boarding house where Matthew had a room, hoping to see him on the front porch in the evenings. They developed their own methods of communication, a private language built on looks and gestures and shared understanding. Jessica began to learn the nuances of Matthew's expressions. She could tell when he was tired by the way his shoulders sagged slightly and his eyes lost some of their usual spark. She could tell when he was amused by the way one corner of his mouth would quirk up before he controlled it. She could tell when he was thinking about her because his gaze would soften and he would look at her as though she was something precious and unexpected. And Matthew, watching Jessica with the intense focus of a man who had learned to communicate through observation, learned her patterns too. He knew that she touched her hair when she was nervous, that she bit her lower lip when concentrating, that her eyes lit up when she talked about books or teaching. The people of Wickenburg began to notice the growing connection between the silent man and the Eastern school teacher. Some approved, thinking it sweet that two lonely people had found each other. Others were less charitable, gossiping about whether a woman like Jessica could really be happy with a man who could not speak, wondering what kind of life they could build together. Mrs. Hartwell spoke to Jessica about it one morning in late January, her voice carefully neutral, as she suggested that Jessica might want to be cautious about being seen too frequently with Mr. Keller. "It is not that there is anything wrong with the man," Mrs. Hartwell said, arranging flowers in a vase with more force than necessary. "He is respectable enough, I suppose, and he did save those horses. But you must think of your future, Jessica. A woman needs a husband who can provide for her, who can speak on her behalf in business matters, who can participate fully in society. Mr. Keller, whatever his other qualities, cannot do those things." Jessica felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "Mr. Keller communicates perfectly well," she said, keeping her voice level with effort. "He is intelligent, kind, and hard-working. I find him excellent company." Mrs. Hartwell sighed. "I am only thinking of your well-being. You are young still, and perhaps you do not realize how difficult life can be, particularly out here. You need a partner who can support you in every way." Jessica did not trust herself to respond to that, so she simply excused herself and went to prepare the day's lessons for the children. But Mrs. Hartwell's words stayed with her. Not because they convinced her, but because they forced her to examine her own feelings. What exactly did she feel for Matthew Keller? And what did she want from their growing friendship? The answer came to her on a bright February morning when she saw Matthew across the street, helping an elderly Mexican woman carry water buckets from the town well. The woman was speaking to him in rapid Spanish, and Matthew was nodding and responding with gestures, his face warm with genuine concern for her welfare. As Jessica watched, he carried the buckets all the way to the woman's small adobe house, refused what was probably an offer of payment, and tipped his hat before heading back down the street. The simple kindness of the act, the way he gave his time and strength without expectation of reward or recognition, made something settle into place inside Jessica's heart. She was not just fond of Matthew Keller, she was falling in love with him. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Jessica had never been in love before. There had been no time for courtship in the difficult years after her father's death, when she had been focused solely on survival. And now here she was, in a dusty Arizona town, losing her heart to a man who could not speak. She tried to tell herself all the practical reasons why this was unwise, but her heart was not interested in practical reasons. Her heart only knew that when she was with Matthew, she felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. His silence was not an absence but a presence, a kind of communication that went deeper than words. She decided she needed to know if he felt the same way. But how did one have such a conversation with someone who could not speak? Jessica lay awake that night, thinking through possibilities, and finally settled on a plan that made her heart race with nervousness and hope. The next afternoon, she told Mrs. Hartwell that she needed a few hours for personal errands. She put on her best dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes, and walked with determination to the boarding house where Matthew lived. The landlady, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Pritchard, looked at her with undisguised curiosity when Jessica asked if she could speak with Mr. Keller. "He is out back, chopping wood for me," Mrs. Pritchard said, her eyes narrow. "I suppose I can call him, though I do not know what business a young lady has calling on a single gentleman." "It is a matter of some importance," Jessica said, drawing herself up to her full height and using the tone she employed when the Hartwell boys were being particularly obstinate. It worked on Mrs. Pritchard as well as it did on 10-year-olds. The woman sniffed but went to fetch Matthew. He appeared a few minutes later, slightly out of breath and with wood chips clinging to his shirt. When he saw Jessica standing in the front parlor, surprise and pleasure chased across his face in quick succession. Then concern: was something wrong? His eyebrows drew together in a question. "Nothing is wrong," Jessica said quickly. I need to speak with you. Privately, if possible." Mrs. Pritchard was hovering in the doorway, clearly hoping to eavesdrop. Matthew saw the problem, thought for a moment, then gestured to the front porch. It was a public enough space to be respectable, but private enough for conversation. Jessica nodded and followed him outside. They stood by the porch railing, looking out at the dusty street. Jessica's courage was starting to fail her now that the moment was at hand. What if she was wrong about his feelings? What if she was about to make a terrible fool of herself? But then Matthew touched her arm gently, and when she looked at him, his eyes were full of patient encouragement. Whatever she needed to say, he would listen. That was what his expression told her, and it gave her the strength to continue. "Mr. Keller, Matthew," she began, then stopped, took a breath, and started again. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will forgive me if I am being too forward, but I have never been very good at hiding my feelings, and I find that I do not want to hide them anymore." He was watching her intently, his whole body still and focused. "These past months, since I came to Wickenburg, getting to know you has been the best part of my days. I look forward to seeing you, to our conversations, and they are conversations no matter what anyone else might think. You communicate more with your eyes and your gestures than most people do with all their words. You have shown me that there are different kinds of language, different ways of being understood." She saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw his hands clench briefly on the porch railing, What I'm trying to say, Jessica continued, her own voice shaking slightly now, is that I have feelings for you, deep feelings. And I needed you to know that whatever happens, whatever you might feel or not feel in return. For a long moment, Matthew simply stared at her, and Jessica felt her heart begin to sink. She had miscalculated. She had read too much into kindness and friendliness, but then Matthew moved quickly and decisively. He took her hands in his, and his grip was warm and strong. He pulled her gently closer, and then he raised one hand to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with incredible tenderness. His eyes were blazing with emotion, joy, relief, love, all mixed together, and she realized he was trembling slightly. He pressed his free hand to his own chest over his heart, then moved it to rest over hers. The message was clear. His heart was hers as hers was his. Then he did something she did not expect. He took her hand and pressed it to his throat, to the scar tissue she could feel beneath his collar. The gesture was vulnerable and trusting, an acknowledgement of his injury and an invitation for her to accept all of him, damage included. I do accept it, she whispered. All of you. Everything you are. Matthew's smile was radiant. He drew her closer still, their faces inches apart, and raised his eyebrows in a clear question. When she nodded just the smallest movement of her head, he closed the distance and kissed her. It was gentle and careful and full of restrained passion. The kiss of a man who had thought he would never have this, never be allowed this kind of closeness. Jessica's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally drew apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Jessica felt like the world had just rearranged itself into a new and better configuration. "Well then," came a sharp voice from the doorway, making them both jump. Mrs. Pritchard stood there with her arms crossed, looking both scandalized and grimly satisfied at having caught them. "I suppose I will need to inform Mrs. Hartwell that her governess has been engaging in inappropriate behavior." Jessica felt Matthew stiffen beside her, felt his instant protective instinct. But she laid a hand on his arm. "You may inform whomever you like, Mrs. Pritchard," she said coolly. "Mr. Keller and I have an understanding, and we have done nothing inappropriate. We are courting, as is perfectly respectable." "Courting," Mrs. Pritchard snorted. "How can you court a man who cannot even speak vows, or ask for your hand properly, or provide for a wife?" "That is between Mr. Keller and myself," Jessica said, her voice firm despite the anger heating her cheeks. "And I will thank you to keep your opinions to yourself." She turned to Matthew, deliberately putting her back to the landlady. "May I see you tomorrow? There's much we need to discuss." Matthew nodded, his eyes still worried but also proud of how she had stood up to Mrs. Pritchard. He squeezed her hand once, a quick gesture of support and affection, and then Jessica swept off the porch with all the dignity she could muster. As she had expected, Mrs. Hartwell summoned her that evening for a private conversation. The older woman was not unkind, but she was firm. "Mrs. Pritchard came to see me this afternoon," she said. "She seems to think you and Mr. Keller are forming an attachment." "We are," Jessica said, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "I care for him very much, and he cares for me." Mrs. Hartwell sighed. "Jessica, I have grown fond of you these months you have been with us. You are good with my children, and you have a sensible head on your shoulders, or so I thought. But this business with Mr. Keller is not sensible. How will he support you? How will you manage the practical aspects of life with a man who cannot communicate in the normal way?" "He communicates perfectly well," Jessica said, echoing her earlier words. "And as for support, many women work alongside their husbands. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Are you speaking of marriage, then?" Mrs. Hartwell looked alarmed. "My dear girl, you have only known him a few months. And the obstacles—" "The only obstacles are the ones other people create," Jessica interrupted, her patience fraying. "Matthew lost his voice, not his mind or his character or his ability to work. He saved those horses at great cost to himself, and the town called him a hero for a week before deciding he was too inconvenient to bother with. That says more about the town than it does about him." Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "You are very passionate about this," she said finally. "I can see that my words will not sway you. But I must ask, Jessica, have you truly thought about what your life would be like? The challenges you would face?" "I have thought about it," Jessica said softly, "and I know it will not always be easy. But I would rather face challenges with Matthew than live an easy life without him." To her surprise, Mrs. Hartwell's stern expression softened slightly. "You love him," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," Jessica admitted, "I do." Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I cannot stand in your way, but you should know that if you marry him, I will not be able to keep you on as governess. It would not be appropriate for a married woman to live in our household." Jessica had expected this, but it still felt like a blow. The position with the Hartwells was the only income she had, and she had few savings. But she lifted her chin. "I understand, and I accept that." Over the following weeks, Jessica and Matthew spent every possible moment together, learning each other in the way of new lovers everywhere. Matthew took her on walks through the desert, showing her hidden canyons and secret springs, places of stark beauty that took her breath away. Jessica taught him more of the simple sign language she had been studying in a book she had found, expanding their ability to communicate complex thoughts. They sat together on the porch of her cottage in the evenings, watching the sun set in spectacular displays of orange and purple, and Jessica would talk about her dreams while Matthew listened and responded with his hands and his eyes. They worked out systems for daily life. Matthew found a small notebook and pencil that he carried everywhere, and while he could not write elaborate sentences, his education had been basic. He could write simple words and draw clear pictures to supplement his gestures. Jessica learned to ask questions in ways that could be answered with nods or shakes of the head, or that gave Matthew options to choose between. And increasingly, they developed an intuitive understanding that transcended any formal language. Jessica could read the slightest shift in Matthew's expression, could tell what he was feeling or thinking from the set of his shoulders or the way he stood. It was intimate in a way she had never experienced, this deep attention to another person. But practical concerns loomed large. Jessica's position with the Hartwells would end if she married, and while Matthew worked steadily, his inability to speak meant he was often passed over for better-paying jobs in favor of men who could call out instructions or deal with customers. They would need money to set up a household, and Wickenburg was not a town that offered many opportunities for a woman to earn independent income. The solution came from an unexpected source. In March, a man named Thomas Brennan arrived in Wickenburg with plans to establish a new ranch about 10 miles outside town. He needed workers to help build the ranch buildings, repair corrals, and eventually manage the cattle he planned to bring in. Thomas was a practical man who cared more about a worker's reliability than his ability to chat, and when Matthew applied for a position, Thomas hired him on the spot after watching him work for a single afternoon. "You are strong, you show up on time, and you do not waste time talking when you should be working," Thomas said, his weathered face creasing in a grin. "Those are qualities I value. The job is yours if you want it, with room and board included and wages paid monthly." Matthew's face when he came to tell Jessica the news was incandescent with happiness. He had written it all down in his notebook, and Jessica read the careful words with growing excitement. "This is wonderful," she said. "Matthew, this changes everything." He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Jessica's breath caught. Inside the box was a simple gold ring, clearly old but polished to a shine. Matthew took it out and showed her the inside where initials had been engraved MK. His own initials. He must have had the ring made, or perhaps it had been his mother's and he had it engraved. Either way, the meaning was clear. He knelt down, right there on the dusty street, and looked up at her with such hope and love in his eyes that Jessica felt tears spring to her own. He could not ask the traditional question aloud, but he held out the ring and raised his eyebrows, and she understood perfectly what he was asking. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, And then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest while people on the street stopped to stare and whisper. Jessica did not care. Let them talk. She had found something rare and precious, and she was not going to give it up because others could not see past Matthew's silence to the man beneath. They were married 6 weeks later in April of 1885, in the same small church where they had spent Christmas Eve together. The ceremony was short and simple, conducted by the circuit preacher who came through Wickenburg once a month. When it came time for Matthew to speak his vows, there was an awkward moment where the preacher looked uncertain, but Jessica had prepared for this. She had written out Matthew's vows on a card, and she read them aloud for him while he stood beside her, his hand over hers, nodding to affirm each promise. When the preacher asked if he took Jessica to be his wife, Matthew's nod was firm and unambiguous. The preacher, to his credit, accepted this and pronounced them married. The small gathering of witnesses, Thomas Brennan and his wife, the Hartwells, Doc Morrison, and a few others who had come to wish them well, applauded as Matthew kissed his bride. It was not the grand wedding Jessica might once have imagined for herself, but it was perfect in its own way. When Matthew looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, she knew she had made the right choice. They moved to the Brennan Ranch the next day, their few possessions packed into a wagon Thomas had lent them. The ranch was raw and unfinished, with only 2 buildings complete: a main house where Thomas and his wife lived, and a smaller cabin that would be home to Matthew and Jessica. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main living space with a stove and table, and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a trunk. But it had a good roof and sturdy walls, and Jessica had never been happier than when she carried her carpetbag across that threshold with Matthew's hand in hers. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment, as all new marriages are. Jessica had to learn to cook on a temperamental wood stove, to manage a household with limited resources, to live without the conveniences she had known back east. Matthew worked long hours with Thomas and the other ranch hands, coming home exhausted, but always making time to sit with Jessica in the evenings, to help her with the heavier chores, to simply be with her. They communicated with increasing ease, their private language becoming more nuanced every day. Jessica learned to read the slightest change in Matthew's expression, and he learned to interpret her moods and needs with uncanny accuracy. There were challenges. When they went into town for supplies, Jessica had to handle all the interactions with shopkeepers, all the negotiations and questions. Some people treated them with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled pity. Once, a man made a cruel joke about Matthew in the saloon, wondering aloud how a mute man could satisfy a wife in any respect. Matthew had started forward, his fists clenched, but Jessica had caught his arm and shaken her head. They had walked away with dignity, but Jessica had felt her husband's frustration and humiliation like a physical pain. That night, in the privacy of their cabin, she had taken his face in her hands and made him look at her. "You satisfy me in every way," she said fiercely. "In every way that matters, Matthew Keller. That man is a fool and a bully, and his opinion means nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." Matthew had nodded, but she could see the doubt lingering in his eyes, the old wounds of rejection and dismissal that her words alone could not fully heal. So she showed him instead, with her hands and her body and her whispered words of love, exactly how much he mattered to her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, his arms around her and his face buried in her hair, she felt him relax truly for the first time since the incident. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing, and she knew he understood what she had been trying to tell him. As spring turned to summer, life at the Brennan Ranch settled into a rhythm. Matthew worked on building new corrals and repairing old structures, his skill with carpentry and his tireless work ethic making him invaluable to Thomas. Jessica tended a small garden, helped Mrs. Brennan with the cooking and cleaning for the ranch hands, and began teaching reading and writing to some of the Mexican children whose families lived on neighboring properties. She charged no fee, but the families repaid her with eggs, vegetables, and the kind of warm friendship that transcended language barriers. In July, Jessica realized she was carrying a child. The signs were unmistakable, though she waited until she was certain before telling Matthew. When she finally did, writing the words on his slate because she wanted to be clear and he could read them carefully, his reaction was everything she could have hoped. He stared at the words, "I am going to have a baby," for a long moment, then looked up at her with wonder and joy transforming his face. He stood and lifted her carefully off her feet, spinning her once before setting her down gently, as if she had suddenly become fragile. Then he knelt and pressed his face to her still flat stomach, his arms around her waist, and she felt his shoulders shake with silent emotion. "We are going to be parents," she whispered, running her fingers through his hair. "You are going to be a father." He looked up at her, and there were tears on his cheeks, tears of happiness she saw, not sadness. He stood and cupped her face in his hands, and then he kissed her with a tenderness that made her own eyes fill. When he drew back, he touched her stomach gently, then made a cradling motion with his arms, his face questioning. "I think January," she said, understanding that he was asking when the baby would come. "Or perhaps early February." The next months were busy ones. Matthew worked even harder, knowing they would need extra money for the baby. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it for hours until there was no possibility of splinters, carving simple designs into the headboard, a horse, a flower, a star. He repaired and reinforced everything in their cabin, making sure it would be safe for a child. And he was constantly solicitous of Jessica, watching her with concern when she looked tired, bringing her water and making sure she sat down to rest. Jessica found his protectiveness endearing, if occasionally a bit much. "I am having a baby, not suffering from a fatal illness," she told him one afternoon when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry, but she could see the fear beneath his concern. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, with limited medical care and so many things that could go wrong. Matthew was terrified of losing her, she realized, and the knowledge made her patient with his overprotectiveness. In December, Doc Morrison made the journey out to the ranch to check on Jessica. He pronounced her healthy and said the baby seemed to be positioned well, but he also warned that he might not be able to get to the ranch in time when her labor started, given the distance and the unpredictable nature of these things. Mrs. Brennan, who had delivered 3 children of her own, assured them she would be there to help, and several of the Mexican women Jessica had befriended also promised their assistance. Matthew looked less than reassured by all this, but there was nothing to be done except wait and hope. Jessica went into labor on a cold January morning in 1886, almost 2 years after Matthew had saved those horses from the burning barn. The pain started slowly, giving them time to send one of the ranch hands for Doc Morrison. Mrs. Brennan came immediately, shooing Matthew out of the cabin and setting up everything they would need. 2 of the Mexican women arrived soon after, bringing herbs and warm compresses and calm, experienced hands. Matthew paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, unable to help, unable even to call out questions about how things were progressing. Thomas Brennan kept him company, offering whiskey that Matthew refused, and conversation that Matthew could barely focus on. The sounds from inside the cabin, Jessica's cries of pain, the low voices of the women helping her were torture to him. He wanted to go to her, to hold her hand, to comfort her, but Mrs. Brennan had been firm about keeping him outside. This was women's work, she had said, and he would only be in the way. The hours dragged on. Doc Morrison arrived in the early afternoon, disappeared into the cabin, and emerged an hour later to tell Matthew that everything was progressing normally, but slowly. First babies often took their time, the doctor said. Matthew nodded, his face tight with worry. He had not heard Jessica's voice in over an hour, and the silence was somehow worse than the cries had been. Finally, as the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, a new sound emerged from the cabin, the thin, furious wail of a newborn baby. Matthew's head jerked up, his eyes wide. He took a step toward the cabin, then stopped, unsure if he was allowed to enter. A moment later, Mrs. Brennan opened the door, her face flushed but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "a healthy boy, and Jessica is doing well. You can come in now, but be quiet and gentle. She is exhausted." Matthew did not need to be told twice. He entered the cabin and saw Jessica propped up in bed, pale and with dark circles under her eyes, but smiling. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in blankets. As Matthew approached, Jessica shifted the blankets to reveal a tiny red face, a shock of dark hair, and hands no bigger than walnuts that waved in the air. "Matthew," Jessica said softly, "come meet your son." Matthew knelt beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the baby. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched one of those tiny hands. Immediately, the baby's fingers closed around his large one, gripping with surprising strength. Matthew's face did what Jessica had rarely seen it do. It crumpled with emotion too large to contain. Silent tears streamed down his face as he looked from the baby to Jessica and back again. "He is perfect," Jessica whispered, "and he is ours. We made him, Matthew. We made this beautiful person." Matthew bent and kissed her forehead, then carefully, hesitantly, pressed a kiss to the baby's head as well. The baby made a small snuffling sound, and Matthew's expression was one of absolute wonder. He looked at Jessica with a question in his eyes, and she understood immediately. "I thought we could name him James," she said, "James Keller. Do you like it?" Matthew nodded emphatically, then spelled it out with his fingers to be sure he understood correctly. James. When Jessica nodded confirmation, he smiled through his tears and touched the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. The weeks after James's birth were exhausting but joyful. Jessica recovered her strength gradually, helped by the women who brought food and advice and their own children to help entertain the new baby. Matthew was besotted with his son, spending every free moment watching him sleep or holding him carefully, his large hands cradling the small body with infinite tenderness. He seemed constantly amazed that he had helped create this tiny person, that he was a father. Jessica watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. She saw the gentleness in him, the patience, the fierce protectiveness. She saw how he would wake in the night when James cried and bring the baby to her for feeding, then walk the floor with him afterward, rocking and soothing without words but with perfect understanding. The baby responded to Matthew as though his silence was not a lack but a different kind of presence. James would calm in his father's arms, would stare up at Matthew's face with unfocused eyes as if trying to memorize every feature. As James grew from a newborn into an infant with a personality, Matthew discovered new ways to communicate with his son. He made exaggerated faces that made the baby laugh, used his hands to create shadow puppets on the wall that fascinated the child, sang soundless lullabies where the melody was carried in the rocking motion of his body rather than in notes. Jessica would watch them together and feel her heart expand with love for both of them. When James was 4 months old, something remarkable happened. The baby had been fussing, not quite crying, but making unhappy sounds that meant he needed something. Matthew had picked him up, checking if he needed changing or was hungry, and then had simply held him, swaying gently. James had quieted, staring up at his father's face. Then in a gesture that made Jessica's breath catch, the baby had reached up and touched Matthew's throat, right where the scars were beneath his collar. Matthew had gone very still. James patted the spot again, then made a cooing sound, his face scrunched in concentration as if he were trying to figure something out. Then the baby smiled, a real deliberate smile, and made more cooing sounds while touching his father's throat. He was trying to communicate, Jessica realized, trying to connect with his father in the way his father connected with the world, through touch and gesture rather than sound. Matthew's eyes found Jessica's across the room, and in them she saw wonder and a kind of healing. His son was not put off by his silence. His son was learning to speak his language. The years that followed were good ones, with the usual mix of joy and hardship that characterized frontier life. The ranch prospered under Thomas Brennan's management and Matthew's hard work. Jessica continued teaching the local children, including James, as he grew old enough to learn his letters. She taught him to read his father's gestures and expressions to understand that communication came in many forms. James's first words were Mama and Papa, and when he said Papa while looking at Matthew, the silent man had wept with happiness. In 1888, when James was 2, Jessica gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the beginning she was a determined, stubborn child who knew exactly what she wanted. Matthew adored her, though he learned quickly that she would not be managed as easily as her more easygoing brother. Rose demanded her father's attention with imperious baby sounds, and when she was old enough to walk, she would follow him everywhere, her little hand clasped in his big one. The children grew up bilingual in a way, fluent both in spoken English and in their father's language of gestures and expressions. They never thought it odd that their father could not speak. To them, he was simply Papa, the man who built them toys and carried them on his shoulders and kept them safe. They learned to read his eyes the way Jessica had, to know when he was pleased or concerned or amused. And Matthew, in turn, learned that being unable to speak did not mean he could not be a good father. His children never doubted his love because he showed it in 1,000 small ways every day. When James was 5, he asked his mother why Papa did not talk like other fathers. Jessica sat him down and told him the story of the burning barn, of the horses his father had saved, of the smoke that had damaged his voice. James listened with wide eyes, then went to find Matthew in the barn where he was working. Jessica watched from the doorway as her son climbed into his father's lap and hugged him fiercely. "You were very brave, Papa," James said, and Matthew held his son close, his face pressed to the child's hair. In 1891, when James was 5 and Rose was 3, Thomas Brennan made Matthew an offer. He was getting older, Thomas said, and he wanted to spend more time with his own grandchildren back in California. He was selling the ranch, and he wanted to sell it to Matthew. They worked out terms that would allow Matthew to pay over time, and suddenly Matthew Keller found himself a rancher, a landowner, a man of property. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible in those dark days after losing his voice. Jessica was proud of her husband, proud of what they had built together. The ranch would never make them rich, but it provided a good living and a solid future for their children. More than that, it was proof that Matthew's silence did not define his worth, that he was capable of everything the talking world said he could not do. They hired hands to help with the work, and Jessica found she enjoyed managing the household accounts and corresponding with buyers in town. She had learned to be Matthew's voice when needed, to speak for him in business dealings while making sure everyone understood that the decisions were his. Most people who knew them understood the dynamic, respected the partnership they had built. Those who did not quickly learned or found themselves dealing with someone else. In 1893, Jessica gave birth to their third child, another boy they named Thomas after Thomas Brennan, who had given Matthew his chance. Thomas was a quiet baby who grew into a thoughtful child, more like his father in temperament than either of his siblings. He seemed to have inherited Matthew's gift for observation, for reading people and situations without words. As he grew, he became his father's shadow, learning ranching from Matthew's patient, wordless instruction. The children brought other children home to play, and Jessica made a point of teaching those children how to communicate with Matthew. Some picked it up easily, treating his silence as simply another fact about him, like his height or the color of his eyes. Others struggled at first but learned. A few parents, uncomfortable with Matthew's difference, discouraged their children from playing at the Keller Ranch, but those families were in the minority. Most people in Wickenburg had come to respect Matthew, had seen the success of his ranch and the happiness of his family, and concluded that whatever they had thought about him being unable to speak, they had been wrong. In 1895, tragedy struck when Mrs. Brennan, who had remained a close friend to Jessica over the years, died suddenly of a fever. Jessica grieved deeply for the woman who had helped deliver her son and had been like a mother to her in this place so far from the home she had known. Matthew comforted his wife, holding her while she cried. his silence a kind of safety where she could let out all her grief without needing to find words for it. The years passed with the rhythm of ranch life seasons of planting and harvest, of calving and branding, of long hot summers and mild winters. The children grew and changed, developing their own personalities and dreams. James wanted to be a rancher like his father. Rose declared she would be a teacher like her mother. Young Thomas said he wanted to work with horses, to train them and gentle them the way Papa did. In 1898, when James was 12, an incident occurred that showed Jessica just how much her son had learned from his father. A new family had moved to town, and their son, a bully named Garrett, had been making fun of Matthew in front of the other children, mocking the way he communicated with gestures. James had defended his father, but when Garrett continued and eventually shoved James, her son had not responded with his fists. Instead, he had stood his ground calmly, had looked Garrett in the eye, and had used the same patient, deliberate gestures his father used to communicate his point that words were cheap, but actions showed who you really were. And James's actions, staying calm in the face of provocation, showed he was stronger than the bully. The other children had agreed, and Garrett had slunk away, humiliated by his own behavior rather than by anything James had said or done. When Matthew heard the story from Jessica, who had heard it from Rose, who had heard it from one of her friends, he had pulled James aside and hugged him hard. Then he had drawn in the dirt with a stick, sketching two figures, one big, one small, and drawn a heart above them both. James understood. He had made his father proud. As the new century approached, the Keller family found themselves well established in Wickenburg. The ranch was profitable, their children healthy and happy, their marriage strong. Jessica sometimes thought back to that Christmas Eve in 1884 when she had first truly noticed Matthew Keller, standing at the back of the church mouthing words to carols he could not sing. She had been so young then, so uncertain about her future. If someone had told her that 15 years later she would be married to that silent man, would be the mother of his 3 children and the co-owner of a successful ranch, she would not have believed it. But life, she had learned, was full of surprises. The best things were often the ones you never saw coming, the ones that did not make sense on paper but made perfect sense in your heart. Matthew had taught her that communication was about so much more than words, that love could be expressed in 1,000 quiet ways, that silence could be as rich and full as any conversation. In the spring of 1900, James turned 14, and Matthew began teaching him the more complex aspects of ranching, negotiating prices, planning for the future, managing workers. Jessica watched her husband and son work together, saw the deep respect and understanding between them, and felt gratitude wash over her. Her children would grow up knowing that differences did not have to be limitations, that a person's worth was not measured in words but in character. That summer, Matthew built a new addition onto their cabin, expanding it into a proper house with a separate parlor and 3 bedrooms so the children could have their own spaces. He worked on it in his spare time, and Jessica helped when she could, the two of them side by side as they had been in everything since their wedding day. When it was finished, they stood together looking at what they had built, not just the physical house, but the life it represented. Jessica turned to her husband, this man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, and touched his face gently. "We did well," she said softly. "Did we not?" Matthew smiled, that transformative smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. He nodded, then took her hand and placed it over his heart. The gesture was the same one he had made when he could not say the words, "I love you," aloud. But Jessica did not need to hear the words. She knew. She had always known. In 1902, Rose turned 14 and announced that she wanted to go to the teaching college in Phoenix. It was a bold plan for a ranch girl, but Jessica and Matthew supported her. They had always taught their children that they could accomplish whatever they set their minds to, and Rose had her mother's determination and intelligence. Matthew worked extra hours to save money for her tuition, and Jessica began preparing her daughter for the challenges she would face. The night before Rose was to leave for Phoenix, Matthew called his daughter to him. In the privacy of the barn, where they had shared many conversations over the years, he gave her a gift. It was a small leather-bound journal, and on the first page he had written in his careful, unpracticed hand, "For Rose. Your voice matters. Use it for good. Love, Papa." Rose had burst into tears and hugged her father fiercely. "I will, Papa," she promised. "I will make you proud." Matthew touched her face gently, then made a gesture that swept from her to himself and back again. Jessica, watching from the barn door, translated softly for Rose's benefit, though she suspected her daughter understood. "You already have." James, at 16, took on more responsibility at the ranch, working alongside his father with the easy partnership of two people who understood each other perfectly. He had developed his own style of communication, blending spoken words with the gestural language his father used, and the ranch hands who worked for them learned to follow instructions from either James or Matthew with equal ease. Young Thomas, at 9, was the family's quiet observer, often found sitting on a fence rail watching his father work with horses. He had Matthew's gift for gentleness, for patience, for communicating with animals in ways that had nothing to do with words. Matthew recognized himself in his youngest son and took extra time to teach him, to show him that there were many ways to make a mark on the world. In 1905, Rose graduated from the teaching college and returned to Wickenburg to teach at the expanded school the town had finally built. She was passionate about education and particularly about reaching students who struggled with traditional learning methods. She incorporated sign language and other forms of communication into her classroom, inspired by her father's example. Parents sometimes questioned her methods, but the results spoke for themselves. Her students thrived, particularly those who had been labeled slow or difficult by previous teachers. That same year, James met a young woman named Catherine who had come west with her family to start a farming operation near the ranch. Catherine was practical and hard-working with a quick smile and a kind heart. She was not put off by Matthew's silence, treating him with the same respect she showed everyone else. When James asked his parents what they thought of Catherine, Matthew had smiled and made a gesture of approval. Jessica, seeing the way her son's face lit up when Catherine's name was mentioned, gave her blessing as well. James and Catherine were married in 1906, in a ceremony held at the ranch with the whole community in attendance. It was a joyous occasion, made even more special when Catherine asked Matthew to walk her down the aisle alongside her own father, a gesture that acknowledged how much the Keller family had welcomed her. Matthew's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he performed that duty, and when he placed Catherine's hand in James's, the love and blessing in his expression needed no words. The newlyweds built a small house on the ranch property, and Catherine proved to be as capable a rancher's wife as she was a farmer's daughter. She and Jessica became close friends, working together to manage the expanded household and plan for the ranch's future. When Catherine became pregnant in 1907, the whole family celebrated the news that a new generation was coming. Matthew's first grandchild was born in February 1908, a girl Catherine and James named Emma. When Matthew held his granddaughter for the first time, Jessica saw the same wonder in his face that had been there when he held his own children. Emma, like all the Keller grandchildren who would follow, would grow up knowing that grandfather did not speak with words but communicated just fine anyway. That spring, as the desert bloomed with wild flowers after an unusually wet winter, Jessica and Matthew celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary. Their children had planned a party, inviting friends and neighbors to the ranch for an afternoon of food and music and celebration. As Jessica stood on the porch watching the festivities, watching her grown and growing family, watching her husband laugh silently at something Thomas was telling him, she felt profound contentment. Rose approached her, slipping an arm around her mother's waist. "You and Papa have built something really special here," Rose said. "You know that, do not you?" Jessica nodded, unable to speak for a moment around the lump in her throat. "We have been very blessed," she managed finally. "It is not just blessings, Mama," Rose said. "It is the two of you, the way you love each other, the way you have shown all of us what really matters. Papa cannot speak, but he has taught me more than anyone else about the importance of communication, about really seeing people and listening to what they are saying beneath their words. You have taught me that love is not about grand gestures, but about daily choices to show up for each other." Jessica turned to hug her daughter. "When did you become so wise?" Rose laughed. "I had good teachers." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Matthew found Jessica and took her hand. He led her away from the party, out to the small rise behind the house where they often sat in the evenings. From there they could see the whole ranch spread out before them, the house, the barns, the corrals, the fields. Beyond that, the desert stretched away to distant mountains, vast and beautiful and unchanged. Matthew sat and pulled Jessica down beside him, his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth, watching the last light fade from the sky. They did not need to speak. After so many years together, words would have been redundant. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned each other's language so completely that the silence itself was a kind of conversation. Jessica thought about the girl she had been when she first came to Wickenburg in 1884, nervous and uncertain, clutching a letter of employment like a lifeline. She had never imagined this life, never dreamed she would find such happiness in a dusty Arizona town, never suspected that she would fall in love with a man who could not speak. But life, she had learned, did not follow the scripts you wrote for it. Life surprised you, challenged you, gave you things you did not know you needed. She had needed Matthew, she realized. Needed his quiet strength, his patient teaching about different kinds of communication, his example of how to live with grace despite difficulty. He had shown her that obstacles were only as large as you allowed them to be, that love could overcome nearly anything if both people were willing to try. And they had tried. Every day for 23 years they had tried. They had learned each other's languages, built a life together, raised children who understood that people were more than their limitations. They had created a place where silence was not a lack, but simply a different way of being, where gestures and expressions carried as much meaning as words. Matthew touched her face gently, turning her to look at him. In the fading light, his face was shadowed, but his eyes were clear and full of love. He made a simple gesture, one of the first she had learned, hand over heart, then extended toward her. "My heart is yours, and mine is yours," she whispered back. "Always has been, always will be." He smiled, then pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of years of shared life, of challenges overcome, of love that had deepened rather than faded with time. When they drew apart, Jessica rested her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. The years continued to pass with their mix of joy and sorrow, triumph and setback. In 1910, James and Catherine had a son they named Matthew after his grandfather. In 1912, Rose married a fellow teacher named Daniel Shepherd, a kind man who shared her passion for education and who treated Matthew with immediate warmth and respect. Thomas, at 17, began working with horses professionally, developing a reputation as a skilled trainer. People came from neighboring counties to have Thomas Keller work with their difficult horses, and he approached each challenge with his father's patient determination. In 1914, when Matthew was 54 and Jessica 52, they became great-grandparents when Emma married and had a child of her own. The family had expanded far beyond what either of them had imagined, a sprawling network of children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the lessons Matthew and Jessica had taught about love, respect, and the many forms of communication. But time takes its toll on everyone, and in 1915, Matthew began to slow down. He was still strong, still capable, but the years of hard physical labor had worn on his body. His back ached in the mornings, his hands were stiff with the beginnings of arthritis. He turned more of the ranch operations over to James, though he still worked every day, still found satisfaction in the physical work that had sustained him for so long. Jessica, too, felt the weight of years. Her hair had gone gray, her face lined with the marks of sun and time. But when she looked at Matthew, she still saw the man she had fallen in love with, still felt her heart quicken when he smiled at her. Age had not diminished their love, had only deepened it. adding layers of shared history and mutual understanding. In the spring of 1917, on a warm April day, Matthew and Jessica celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. Their children organized another party, though this one was smaller and quieter, more suited to the celebrant's age and preference. As evening fell and the guests departed, Matthew and Jessica sat together on the porch, holding hands and watching the desert turn gold in the sunset. 32 years, Jessica said softly. Can you believe it? Matthew shook his head, his expression wondering. He raised their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that still made her heart flutter after all these years. I would not change a single day of it, Jessica continued. Well, perhaps a few of the particularly difficult days, but overall. She laughed softly. You have made me very happy, Matthew Keller. He turned to face her fully, and his free hand came up to touch her face with infinite gentleness. His eyes held everything he could not say aloud, the depth of his love, his gratitude that she had seen past his silence to the man beneath, his wonder that she had chosen him and kept choosing him every day for over 3 decades. Jessica read all of this in his expression as easily as she would have read words on a page. I love you too, she whispered, understanding. So very much. They sat together as the stars emerged. 2 people who had learned each other's language so thoroughly that they could communicate volumes without a single spoken word. The silence between them was rich and full, packed with shared memories and deep affection. It was the silence of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and had built a life more beautiful than either could have imagined. As Matthew held his wife close, feeling her warmth against his side, he thought about that night 33 years ago when the barn had burned, when he had lost his voice but saved those horses. At the time, it had seemed like the end of everything, a tragedy that would define and limit the rest of his life. He had not known then that it would lead him to Jessica, that his silence would become the foundation for a love deeper than any he could have found otherwise. She had learned to read his eyes and gestures, had learned to hear what he could not speak aloud, and in doing so had given him a gift beyond measure, the gift of being truly understood. The ranch that spread out before them in the darkness, the children and grandchildren sleeping in houses nearby, the life they had built together, all of it had grown from that terrible night, and the choice Jessica had made to see past his limitations to his heart. Matthew tightened his arm around his wife, and she snuggled closer, perfectly content. In the house behind them, their great-granddaughter began to cry, and they heard Catherine's soft voice soothing her. The sound made Jessica smile. Life goes on, she said, generation after generation, all of them carrying forward what we have taught them. Matthew nodded, and in the starlight she saw him smile as well. They had done well, the 2 of them. They had taken a hard thing, his lost voice, her loneliness in a strange place, and transformed it into something beautiful. They had proven that love did not require perfect circumstances, only willing hearts. They had shown their children and grandchildren that communication was about so much more than words, that the deepest truths were often conveyed in silence and gesture and the honest meeting of eyes. As they sat together under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by the life they had built, Matthew and Jessica Keller felt peace settle over them like a blessing. They had loved well and been loved in return. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had created a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. What more could any 2 people ask from life? The night deepened around them, gentle and star-filled, wrapping them in its embrace, and in the silence that was their native language, Matthew and Jessica spoke of love and gratitude and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived together. No words were needed. They never had been.